Friends, welcome back. Today we're going to have a look at Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 37. Mark chapter 9, verse 30 to 37. So if you have a Bible, open up to Mark chapter 9. And if not, then listen as I read the Bible in English. Then they left that place and made their way to Galilee, but he did not want anyone to know it. For Jesus was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after he is killed, he will rise 3 days later." But again they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, because on the way they had been arguing with one another about who was the greatest. Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a child, had him stand among them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one little child such as this in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but him who sent me." Now, friends, this is a key part of Mark's gospel and the teaching that we get about what Jesus has come to do and how we must then follow him, how we respond to what Jesus has done. Now, for the second time, Jesus makes what we call the passion prediction. He makes a prediction about what is going to happen to him. Again, for the second time, he refers to himself as the Son of Man, and he says the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men, and they're going to kill him, and then after they kill him, he will rise 3 days later. Now, the disciples, his close friends, they still don't understand what he's talking about, and they are scared to ask him. But then they keep going to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, Jesus asked them what they were arguing about. You see, the disciples, they started arguing with each other as they were going to Capernaum. And the argument confirms for us that they didn't understand what Jesus was saying about the Son of Man dying and rising again. Because their argument was, who is the greatest among all of us disciples? See, they were arguing because they wanted to know who was the best, who was the greatest. And what it showed was they didn't understand what Jesus was coming to do. You see, if he was the king and they had to follow him as the king's servants, as the king's people, then the reality is that they didn't understand what it meant that Jesus had to suffer and die and rise again. And it has to do with this key word. It has to do with being a servant. You see, Jesus is a powerful king, but the way that he acts, the way that he brings about his kingdom, the way that he brings people to join his kingdom, to be reconciled, to be friends with God again, is that Jesus doesn't act like a king and therefore tell people what to do. Jesus acts like a servant and serves people. He does things that are better for other people by dying so that they can come back to God. And Jesus, he asked them what they're discussing, and they didn't really want to tell him because that's what he was talking about. And so he says to them, by sitting down with his closest 12 disciples, he says, "Just so you know, if anybody wants to be first, they actually have to be last." You see, Jesus, the Son of Man, is the greatest of all the people. Jesus, the Son of Man, is first because the Bible says that he is first, because he is the most powerful of all of them. In Daniel 7, in the Old Testament, we see that the Son of Man, one like a Son of Man, was so powerful that he has all dominion and authority and power in the kingdom. And yet, Jesus, who is first, is going to be last. Jesus, who is first, is going to serve everybody else by being like a servant. He is going to die for them. And so he says, if you want to be first, if you want to be like me, then act like me. If you really want to be first, you have to be last. And he uses an example. He takes a child and then he uses the child as an example and he says, whoever welcomes one little child like this in my name also welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me, as in welcomes Jesus, also welcomes the one who sent Jesus. Now, the one who sent Jesus is God the Father. And so by welcoming Jesus, he is saying you then welcome God into your life. But the one who welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. I think here Jesus is talking about the example of one that is like a child. So he's not talking about we must all welcome children, although children are very important and we want to keep welcoming and loving children. But what he's really referring to is he is saying you have to be like a child. You have to be innocent and dependent like a child. That means that a child needs their father and mother. A child has certain things that they cannot do by themselves. And Jesus is saying, you need to be like that. You need to welcome others like that. You need to act like that. You need to be dependent on me. You need to trust me. And that is the way in which you are able to be first in the kingdom, because you are being last in the kingdom. It is not about being someone who cares about themselves. It is not about being someone who is better than everyone else. It is about being someone who humbles themselves, who brings themselves low, who understands that they need the help of others. That is the example we see in Jesus. Jesus, although he is the most powerful, brings himself low. And so we, as his followers, we also bring ourselves low in order to be like Jesus. Now, what do we learn from all this? Well, we learn that Jesus is the one who is going to suffer and die and then rise from the dead. That is what, remember, even God in the cloud speaks to the people saying, "This is my son, listen to him." And when Jesus says this, we need to listen to him. This is how the king brings the kingdom. This is how the Messiah, God's chosen king, allows us to be part of his kingdom, to be reconciled, to be friends with God again. We also learn what it's like to follow Jesus. You see, we see that Jesus is going to do this work for us. And because of the way that he does this work, it teaches us how we as people who follow Jesus need to live. We need to also be like Jesus in that we are not to try and be first. We are trying to be a servant. In order to be first, we need to be last. We need to humble ourselves. We need to do as Jesus has taught us to do. And so, friends, we learn that following Jesus really does mean taking up our cross and following him. We will lose our life. We will not be the type of people who will look to be first in everything, who look to be the best in everything. We will be the type of people who will look to serve others, who will look to be humble, who will look to think of others before ourselves, because by doing this we will be first, because we will be following what our King has taught us.